Ladies and gentlemen, it is time now to welcome Devdutt Pattanaik. Talking about what the Gita can teach us in today's India. And this need not be a religious session. This can as well be an atheistic session. In conversation with him will be Debanjan Chakrabarti.
Kshetre Victoria Kshetre Samaveta Yujutsava. Ladies and gentlemen assembled here for a session on discovering your Gita. So all the gentlemen out there whose wives are called Gita, this is exactly the session you should be in. Discovering your Gita with Devdutt Pattanaik, India's most famous, I think, mythologist, and a man of many parts, a real doctor, and he's had an amazing career spanning pharmaceutical industry, high-end consulting with Ernst & Young, which explains why he looks so young, and author of over 30 books, mythologies, but also a work of fiction. He's written for children. He has over 500 columns in newspapers. He is now on a TV show called Devlok on the Epic channel. And amongst his most celebrated and well-known books are Jaya, an illustrated history of the Mahabharata, Sita, an illustrated history of the Ramayana, Shikhandi, and other tales they won't tell you. And of course, most recently, My Gita. And Devdutt, I was talking to Devdutt yesterday, and it transpires that he's got a sweet tooth, and he believes that the Rasgulla comes from Odisha, not here. So there's a score to settle with him after this session for all of you guys out there. And it has nothing to do with his Odia surname. He is born and brought up in Bombay, aka Mumbai. And so yes, on to discovering our Gita. Devdutt, I was wondering if I could pop the first question along the lines of this whole business of myth and mithya, as one of your books call it, and itihas. I mean, how historic is the Gita?
You see, I define it very simply. Fiction is nobody's truth. History is everybody's truth. Mythology is somebody's truth. And if you just keep it simple, then they're all different forms of truth. And if you break free from the binary, then you are okay with it, because then you understand that mythology is not trying to communicate, it's not a reportage of events. It's trying to communicate meaning. It's trying to make sense of life and the world, which is not the purpose of history. The purpose of history is to just tell you what happened, and after that it is commentary. But the purpose of mythology, and that's fundamentally different, it doesn't care for rationality, it doesn't care for evidence, it doesn't care for anything. It is generation after generation, I communicate meaning. And therefore it is the subjective truth of a people communicated through stories, symbols, and rituals. So subjectivity is the key word. When you talk of history, objectivity is important. So data is important, fact is important, evidence is important. It doesn't matter in mythology. Story is story. Whatever the mother tells the child is the truth of the mother being shared with the child. And the child may or may not receive it, but will shape the child's mind.
What kind of a story is then the Gita? What kind of a narrative it is? It's got this babushka doll kind of structure, isn't it? It's sits within the Mahabharata, and then in your book you talk about the complex context within which the discourse of Gita takes place. So
I'll give you an analogy. So imagine the Vedas as a tree. the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are fruits of that tree, and the Gita is the seed inside that fruit. So they're all connected in one way, because traditionally Vyasa, when he had finished classifying and putting together the hymns of the Vedas in a particular format, in the 4 Vedas, he realized that it is not reaching the masses, and therefore created the 5th Veda, which is the Mahabharata, and in the story format. And in the story, it's full of dialogues, and the dialogues are really attempting to rediscover through storytelling, through events, the Vedic truth. So it's like a full circle. So the seed gives rise to the plant gives rise to the fruit gives rise to the seed, and therefore they're connected to each other. That's how I locate the Gita as part of the Mahabharata, which is part of Puranic traditions, which is part of the Vedic traditions.
When one of the really striking aspect of your book, My Gita, is the way you have almost taken the Gita chapters apart and reassembled it. Would you like to tell us about how you went about that restructuring and reorganization of the Gita?
You see, what I wanted is, when the person finishes the book, whoever picks up the book, when he finishes the book, without dumbing it down, they get a sense of what the Gita is, or at least what I have been able to see in the Gita. I don't know what Krishna actually told Arjun. We will never know. Or we will know what he said. We don't know what Arjun actually heard. What we can receive from the Gita is what makes sense to me, and I wanted whatever makes sense to me to reach out to the audience. And I realized if you just go, which is the traditional method, is verse by verse, chapter by chapter, it can be a little overwhelming, because ideas hit you one after the other with such velocity that after the 2nd chapter you don't want to go forward. You're finished, because the words themselves are so loaded with meaning and ideas that you're like, bas ho gaya. So what happens in the 3rd chapter? What happens in the 4th? Why 18 chapters? Why are there 700 verses? Why are 500 of them spoken by Krishna? Why are there so many interjections by Arjun? Why does Sanjay talk? Why does Dhritarashtra have one speak in that? So these are the things that I said, what is the structure? And I'm obsessed with structure, because I always feel a good book has a good structure. And therefore, I've looked at the book from a structural point of view, and I realized that there is a structure that is existing in the Gita. It's like a forest at first with no structure, and then you suddenly realize there's a path. And then over time you realize it's not just a path through a forest, but it's actually a very clearly defined garden where everything is in the right place. And then you realize that the book begins with the problem statement. The chapter 2 gives you a solution, a quick solution. Chapter 3 to 17 elaborates the solution. Chapter 18 reinforces the solution. So it's structured in a very, very dramatic way. And then you realize it moves first using behavioral things. So karma yoga is talked about. So action, what you're supposed to do, the non-negotiable. And then it goes into an emotional space. And so bhakti yoga comes. So emotion becomes important. And only then, when the emotion has been dealt with, it goes into the intellectual space and goes into jnana yoga. So you suddenly see there's a method behind the madness, not random. There is a process taking place. And then when you further break it down, you start realizing that the behavioral portion or the karma yoga portion involves 2 words. 2 words come out very strongly, which are not very strong later. It's yagna and yoga. So it uses yagya and yoga. Yagya, and each word has loaded with meaning. Then you come to the bhakti part, and you suddenly have the ideas of Jivatma, Paramatma, Bhagavan, Brahman, Avatar becoming important. And when you go to the 3rd section, which is highly intellectual, identity starts becoming important. You start talking about Maya, start talking about Moha, you talk about Mada, you start talking about the gunas. Gunas become again and again and again, the gunas are being mentioned, and you have moksha being talked about. So suddenly you see there's a method, and I said, what is the best way to present this? So I decided to approach it thematically. So I said, okay, there will be a before the Gita, after the Gita, and there will be 18 chapters. And again, 18 became important for me because you see, Mahabharata has 18 chapters. It's a war fought. There are 18 armies involved in the fight. Gita has 18 chapters. So 18 is very important, and I kept asking, why is 18 important? And then it struck me that Krishna repeatedly refers to the human body as Navadvarapura, the body with 9 gates. And then I said 18 means 2 cities with 9 gates. So one city and you are another city. So when we are having a conversation, it's 2 cities with 18 gates. And therefore 18, it struck me as perhaps talking about human relationships. Because a city with 9 gates is a lonely city. A city with 2 cities with 18 is a civilization. It's 2 human beings having a conversation. It's Upanishad. It is what Arjuna and Krishna are doing. And I think that caught my attention. That was like, this is something exciting. It is because it is a story of relationships. Now, this is not the way we approach the Gita typically. We go verse by verse by verse by verse because that's how we are taught. But when you start approaching it structurally, it starts giving you new ideas, new thoughts. You look at from a historicity point of view. So when you start looking at the Gita, you start realizing there's so much more even before you start translating or looking at the first verse. So I enjoyed that process. I love structure a lot, and therefore structure, that's how I designed the book. 18 themes. I'll explain each theme very carefully. So yoga, yagya. We use these words so casually. Look at the history of the word. So all this.
I think it really did strike me that how much the book, your book, is structured around the key words, as it were, from the Gita. One point that you make in your introduction, it's a brilliant introduction to the Gita, I must say, is about the nature of the text of the Gita, that it's not, you make this point, that it's not meant to be read from start to finish as a personal readerly experience. It's meant to be interpreted by someone. It's meant to be read aloud by someone and interpreted. Did that play a role in the way you approached, the way you wrote it all down?
See, conversation plays a very important role in India. Conversation. We never liked writing. Writing is disembodied knowledge. It is a knowledge outside the human being. So you can put it in a book and it's outside you. There's no person. Oral tradition is knowledge is always embodied. There is a person and the knowledge. And therefore, whether it's the Ramayana, whether it's the Mahabharata, it's always narrated. So Bhagavata is Shuka Muni telling Parikshit. Mahabharata is Astika is listening to the stories. There is the serpent sacrifice happening. There are in a Naimisha forest there are sages talking. There's always conversation, which is Upanishad. Gita is an Upanishad, the conversation. So for me, the role of the speaker. So even in the traditional way, you will open a book, you will read it out, and there will be a katha vachan, and there will be a telling of it. This one-way thing, but the whole process is to. The approach in India is, somebody had once pointed out, the Indian word for translation is anuvad, which is not exactly translation. It is rendering it in your own way. So it goes through your subjectivity and passes on to the subjectivity of the other person. You get inspired by the verses and it enters your subjectivity and then you pass it on to the other person and that person sort of figures something out of it. I think this personalization and rendering within my own experience is very, very important. It has always been important to me. In fact, the moment I started using the word subjective, the mythology opened up to me. The whole wisdom opened up to me.
It's very interesting when you said that, this way of, a written text, the way we engage with a written text is not really a very Indian way of, doing things, writing. Which brings me to my next question about the variable reception of the Gita in India, in the West. What kind of a book is the Gita? I mean, one interpretation of the Gita is it's like a book of peace. The other is that it's like the Indian Art of War by Sun Tzu. And then, of course, there's been fairly more recent controversy around Wendy Doniger's interpretation of the Gita, where she basically ends the chapter on Gita by quoting Romila Thapar, where she says that had Buddha been the charioteer, the story of Gita would have been entirely different. So this whole, conflict or debate between the left liberal secular interpretation of the Gita, if I may use very loose terms, and then on the other end of the line is someone like Rahul Malhotra, who is this NRI interpreter of the Gita and kind of completely takes over the discourse from a very strange perspective.
See, there is no the Gita, and everybody is entitled to their reading of the Gita, because my reading of the Gita is a function of my limitations. Your reading of the Gita is a function of your limitations. We are all have limitations. And we can only read things in a particular way. Our personality filters whatever comes through. And that becomes very powerful in books like the Gita, because they are highly allegorical. The language used, the words used, the structure used, the meter used is not definitive. It is not giving you very clear manual-like instructions which are like dumbed down for every lowest common denominator. It is designed almost like a puzzle that you and everybody will take what little. So if you, for example, look at the history of the Gita, which is 2,000 years old, it's written in Sanskrit. I mean, the text, the scripture, maybe, if you ask someone from a they'll say 10,000 years ago, because everything in India happens 10,000 years ago. But the text is 2,000 plus years ago. The text itself, it's post-Panini Sanskrit. It's between the Mauryan and the Gupta period. What is the historical context of this period? Buddhism is powerful, which means people are renouncing the world. They are talking about going to the viharas. And at the same time, imperial power is on the rise. There is war going on. There are kings, ambitious young men mimicking Persian kings, wanting to create great empires. So on one side you have ambition. On the other side you have renunciation. And it is in this historical context that the Ramayana and Mahabharata is being written, all of which are talking about how a good king should function. So it's clearly kingship is an important issue, because you have one king who gives up his wife, his family, his children, and becomes a sage. Another king is willing to slaughter millions of people to become the great Chakrabarti, the great Maharaja Dhiraja. And in that you have these two books which are talking about the good king. What is a good king? That's the primary narrative of the Ramayana and Mahabharata. They are both, as I say, property disputes. Ramayana is about property. Ayodhya, Kishkinda, Lanka. Mahabharata is about property. It's about Kurukshetra, Indraprastha, land, who owns the land, development, Khandavprastha. Now this is the essay. And then suddenly for 500 years you have a bit of a silence. And then Gita starts emerging with Shankaracharya, who is creating a monastic order within Hinduism, which wasn't really so before that. There was Buddhist monastic orders. Hindu monastic orders were there, but they were not that powerful. And suddenly you have this Vedanta schools emerging. You have Ramanuja emerging. You have, the Sanskrit acharyas, all of whom were celibate men who renounce family life, commenting on the Gita. Followed by a bhakti period where again you have a whole bunch of regional literature emerging which only focus on bhakti, written by young men like Jnaneshwar, like Balram Das in Odisha, who are writing these bhakti kavyas, and suddenly Krishna bhakti becomes important. And then you have that's happening during the Islamic period. The Muslims have come to India, book has become important, script has become important. And then you have the British coming in and trying to understand this country, because the more you understand the people you control, the better you control them. And therefore they like this book, because unlike Vedas, which is polytheistic, this is far more monotheistic. It sort of aligns with the East India Company, saying that now we can connect more with Indians. And it's the translated works which are read by the founding fathers of our country, like Gandhi and Nehru. And they have reading these translated works, which Edwin Arnold, who translates the Gita, has also translated the Buddha's book. And that's shaping the idea of India. So everyone is reading it in a context. So is Rajiv Malhotra, so is Wendy Doniger. Each one is, so Rajiv Malhotra is an NRI. He doesn't have an Indian passport. He's an American passport. He lives in America. He has a diasporic guilt, shame associated with it. There is this great thing that, where do I belong? And this desperate yearning for an India which is perfect and there's nothing wrong with it, although I have given it up. And there you have Wendy also sitting in America, interested in India, and it's something about Americans very much interested in India. And Wendy's writing the book, and she's coming from a very simple view of the world that violence is bad, Buddha is good, Krishna is promoting violence. It's a very simplistic, good Buddhism, bad Hinduism. It's nice, neat structure which creates oppressors, oppressed, which enables you to create a structure that helps you feel self-righteous without understanding the complexities of these narratives. So each one is bringing their own thing, and each one is bringing value. Let me point, because each one is bringing through their limitations something to lean, something to think about, something to question. So everyone's view matters. Everyone, and that's why Samvad will happen, because I listen to you. I listen to you and I figure out my Gita. So I'm listening to their Gita. So Wendy's Gita is a violent text designed to justify violence. And you're like, really? I don't see it that. And somebody else says, though, this is the great motivational speech that enables you to win wars, Sun Tzu and the Art of War. And you're like, well, really, if you read the book, the Pandavas don't really win the war because they lose all their children. That's not a victory. The Krishna has ensured that the entire clan is wiped out. Draupadi wins, gets her revenge, but her children are killed. That's a Pyrrhic victory. It's called a Pyrrhic victory. That's not victory. And there is something else happening, because when you read the remaining 6 chapters of the Mahabharata, where the complex notions of heaven and victory and anger and rage and disillusionment are being discussed, it's a complex idea. It's not a simple violence is good and violence is bad conversation. It is the role of violence in civilization. What is acceptable, what is unacceptable. Even acceptable violence has horrifying consequences. The best of actions will have horrible consequences. The kindest of behavior can have, and that complexity, you think you've done good. Yeah, you have done good. But that doesn't mean your children will survive. So Pandavas may fight for the Dharma Sthapana, but Abhimanyu will die. And Ghatatkoch will die. That, well, sorry, collateral damage. But that will be told. And that horror of the narrative, and the folk tales which try to explain around it, which brings in the real complexities, because Arjun is wondering, like, really, did you give me what I want? Because that's not how Sun Tzu is designed. Sun Tzu is very clearly designed to win the war with spending the least amount of resources. It's a clearly stated purpose. While Gita is dealing at a psychological level. It is asking the question. I mean, if Buddhism is talking about life is suffering, and therefore